Aneta Markowska is a senior US economist at Societe Generale. She joins me now from New York. Well, first of all, thank you very much for joining us, and just give me your reaction to those figures.
I would say it was a pretty decent report. The headline was in line with expectations, but we picked up an additional 72,000 jobs on revisions. Obviously, the household survey was very good, pushing the unemployment rate down to 8.6%. So, still a long way to go, certainly, to get the unemployment back to where we need it, but it was a pretty decent report.
Well, as you're saying, the unemployment rate is at 8.6% from 9%. Will this trend continue to fall, do you think?
We're skeptical on whether this can be sustained. The types of gains we're seeing in the household employment, about 300,000 per month over the last 4 months. This really, in order for this to be believable, we would have had to have seen GDP growth on the order of 5%, and that's obviously not the case. So we don't think that's sustainable. It's a very volatile survey, and I assume that it converges back to the payroll survey in the next few months.
Well, the pace of hiring in November reduced the unemployment rate. I mean, how long do you think that could go on?
We actually look for the economic activity to slow down a little bit as we get into the early part of the year of next year. There's still a number of headwinds on the horizon. Europe, number one, but also some big fiscal questions here at home. Payroll tax cuts, some tax breaks for business investment that expire at the end of the year. So I think those headwinds will start to hit the data in the early part of 2012, causing some slowdown in demand and eventually leading to some slowdown in employment. So we sort of caution investors to not extrapolate from this recent momentum.
Of course, now you talk about those headwinds. Of course, what's going on in Europe is one. I mean, how do you think that is going to affect the US, and is it affecting them already?
We haven't seen the impact in hard activity data yet, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about layoffs in the financial sector. I think it's a matter of time before this starts showing up in employment numbers. And then also, as far as credit conditions in the U.S., I think it will eventually impact those and lead to some tightening in conditions, which should impact growth as well. Again, I think there's some lags here involved, but by early next year we would expect to see some impact in real activity.
And if we saw Europe head into a recession, do you think the US could withstand that?
We think it can. It obviously depends on the severity of recession in Europe. We actually are forecasting a mild recession in Europe in the first half of next year, and no recession in the U.S. It really depends on the severity. I think, from a cyclical standpoint, the U.S. is pretty well positioned, high profit margins, low inventories. So domestically, we really don't see any signs that the cycle here is running out of steam. We would really have to be hit with pretty severe external shock in order to derail the U.S. cycle, and the type of tightening in financial conditions that we're anticipating is just not enough to derail the U.S. cycle at this stage.
What about if we saw perhaps a breakup of the euro or a partial breakup of the euro? Do you think that might have an effect?
Oh, and it's certainly in that case definitely would have knock-on effects on the banking system, not just in Europe, but globally, and that obviously would be a huge game changer for the global economy, but that's just not our central scenario.
What about the US, though? I mean, do you think, given some of this positive data and that perhaps it is a little stronger at the moment, do you think it will avoid a double dip?
The U.S., yes. Certainly the recent data reinforces the view that the U.S. is not going to go into recession. The consumers picked up quite a bit. We're seeing some signs of life in housing activity. I think in the absence of the European sovereign crisis, the U.S. would be growing pretty close to 3%. That would be our forecast for 2012. We're below that primarily on the back of European headwinds. Our forecast is 1.4%. But again, I still think that when you look at the domestic sector in the U.S., it's certainly not strong growth, but it's decent growth. And again, I think we would need to be hit with a much deeper shock in order to derail the cycle here in the United States.